What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and welcome back to another Magic the Gathering video, and we're finally getting around to kind of covering the Spotlight series that took place in Atlanta just this past weekend, and essentially marking the return of Grand Prix style events, these big free tournaments where you can qualify for the Pro Tour, you don't have to go through the RCQ circuit. On top of that, too, giving out some very interesting and unique prizes, and it seems like they're going to be different for each event going forward, where this one, the winner of the event actually got a full case, which is like, I think, six booster boxes of every standard legal set that is going to be released in 2025. That's a really cool prize on top of winning 10K and, of course, qualifying for the Pro Tour, all top 8 players qualifying for the Pro Tour, as well as getting a cash prize. So pretty neat event. There was, I think, almost 1,500 people that were registered and actually competed in this event. It's one of it, in terms of like Grand Prix and things like that, it'd be like one of the biggest Grand Prix of all time. So definitely a big way for Standard to make a huge return back to kind of the mainstream, where I think people were kind of dunking on it, saying it really wasn't good. And I would say maybe a few years ago you would have been correct, but definitely in the past like 6 months to a year, we've had great Standard sets coming out, and we've had great formats to come of it. And after rotation, everything has just been kind of gravy. So we're going to be going over the event. We're going to be cataloging, the day 1 metagame, the day 2 conversion rates, and what that metagame ended up looking like. And of course, going over some of the standings as well and what actually won the event. But of course, before we get into any of that stuff, if you're already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos from me, where we talk mainly about the Standard, Modern, and Pioneer formats, as well as doing some other longer form videos, and even doing a little bit of our own coverage on events such as this. So if you're interested in any of that stuff, please consider subscribing and ring that notification bell so you know when videos get posted. It's a free, easy way to support me and my content. And if you'd like to support me even further, I got a few links in my description down below. One goes to my Discord server. You can go ahead, follow that link, and join over there. You can also follow me on Twitch, link down in the description below. And finally, I want to thank the sponsor of the channel, Manatraders. If you use my code down in the description down below and you're not already currently signed up for Manatraders, you can get 5% off your monthly subscription, and it'll allow you to rent different cards from Manatraders to then play in various different events, whether it's hosted by Magic Online themselves or even through Manatraders themselves, as they do host a monthly tournament that you can enter and get even bigger prizes if you have a Manatraders subscription. So, use my code down below. I get a little bit of a kickback. You get 5% off. It ends up being a win-win for all of us. So go ahead, check out Manatraders. It's a really great service. I've been with them for almost 5 years on and off, and I've just been very happy with their service, and they're always kind of getting better as well. So be sure to check them out. And with all that said, let's go ahead and let's start off with looking at our standings from the event. And after that flawless transition, let's go ahead. Let's take a look. I have the top 50 results pulled up because you can only go in increments of 25 and 50, and I wanted to at least show off the top 32. So really our top 8 consisted of players Nicholas Odenheimer, who ended up actually winning the event with Gruul Aggro, which if you go to the Casual Spikes podcast, that's kind of where we did had some of our predictions and what we kind of expected to see from this metagame. And definitely the red aggro variants were the main aggro decks that I think players were kind of expecting to see in this format. Of course, we know that there's different convoke strategies that I think are very well positioned in the format with the kind of the existence of these more spot removal heavy decks. But Gruul Aggro, nonetheless, is definitely a way that you can punish your opponent for some relatively slow draws, where I think the ceiling is maybe a little bit lower than some of the convoke decks. I also think that you're a lot more consistent than the convoke decks, especially. So Gruul Aggro, I think, is definitely a good choice. And I mean, for the 16-2 record that Nick Odenheimer ended up putting up, needless to say that the deck is probably pretty good, some would say, but ended up actually winning the event and being the person to take home, all those prizes we talked about: 10K in cash Monet, a Pro Tour invite, and of course a case of every standard legal set that's going to be released in 2025, which I believe is up to like 6 sets, so it's like 36 boxes of product, which is absolutely amazing. Definitely going to be helpful when kind of preparing for Pro Tours, when limited is kind of a huge part of that environment and stuff. And we're going to be going over some of the other future Spotlight series as well. So again, be sure to subscribe if you want to get more information about those events or what's going on and kind of get some kind of primer. I'm definitely going to do a little bit better coverage for the future events of the Spotlight series than we got to do for Atlanta. So be on the lookout for that. We saw Scott McNamara piloting this Dimir Enchantments deck. We know that Esper Pixie, and it's something that we're going to go over when we get to the metagame section, but Esper Pixie was kind of this new deck that showed up over the last few weeks and ended up performing very well, not only at this event, but obviously leading up to the event as well. People really thought it was going to be kind of a mainstay of the format, and while I don't think there was really any straight up Esper versions of the deck, which they definitely have their pros and cons, the Dimir version seemed to be pretty sweet. I mean, I saw Jerry Thompson on camera, and Jerry is always up to something. Like, he kind of just feels like him, or like Patrick Chapin back in the day. They just know something that some of the other players don't necessarily know. And while I don't think Jerry Thompson had really good showing on camera, I think the deck itself definitely has some legs, and there's definitely going to be some key differences in seeing, like, if you kind of keep going towards this, you know, Esper version of this Enchantments deck, or if you stay Dimir. But either way, like, having this sort of kind of Dimir deck where you're playing a little bit of like a mid-range deck, but you're also doing the, you know, bouncing and replaying of some very powerful enchantments that, you know, if you are able to abuse those ETB triggers, you're going to be in a very good position. A 29-9-6 record overall in games, and a 14-2-2 record overall is definitely a very good showing, I would say, for this Dimir Enchantments deck. Rounding out the semifinals, we have Domain Control and Temur Otters. Temur Otters was kind of a deck that I think saw a lot of play and was definitely seeing a lot of play post-Worlds. But then after a little bit of time, it seemed like everyone else was kind of gravitating more towards like the Esper Pixie deck. We've seen kind of a Selesnya aggro deck. We've seen just some other strategies pop up, as well as some other strategies kind of getting bolstered from just, again, seeing all kinds of play through different challenges, different online events, that I think Temur Otters kind of fell by the wayside, and here we are having a top 4 finish from the deck is a very good showing here. And then Domain Control. Domain's not really a deck that I respect a whole lot, not because I think it's bad or anything. I just feel like there's other strategies of doing like the Beanstalk thing that are better than necessarily the Domain decks. I think they're maybe just a little bit more consistent, easier on the mana base, things like that, which I even think like this Domain Control deck, I don't know if it was like playing necessarily anything like super crazy here. You know, we see like Lush Porticos, the Verges, the Flood Farm, things like that, being more so of like a Bant deck, and then, you know, having these other, you know, land types, and then of course the Overlord of the Hauntwoods being able to fix your basic land types to kind of get some of the domain value. But, you know, this is a deck that, you know, going into your RCQs, you're definitely going to have to be on the lookout for, because Domain Control is definitely a deck that I think if we have kind of like these Pixie decks and they're playing sort of like these mid-range strategies, you just want to be like necessarily the bigger mid-range deck. And with the types of interaction that the Domain Control decks have in the early game, I think that you're going to definitely be able to go a lot bigger with your 7-mana Overlords, your 5-mana Overlords, getting to draw cards from Beanstalk, and then just kind of control the board with like your very, very powerful spot removal. So Domain Control, I'm definitely a little bit higher on it now post-event, but it's definitely not a deck that I would necessarily consider taking. I definitely prefer a lot of the different aggro strategies, and even the Esper Pixie deck, I think to me looks like a very enticing choice going forward into some of these like qualifier events. Rounding out our top 8, we have Azorius Oculus. It's not really a deck that we've seen a while. If you don't know what this does, essentially you try to get an Abhorrent Oculus into the graveyard, or a Haughty Djinn. There's also a Kiora in here, which I really like this a lot. But these are the two main cards. They're just going to get you a ton of value, and you try to get them back with your 1 or 2 mana, like, you know, I'll call them resurrection spells, and to bring it back into play, you know, Djinn is going to be able to deal a ton of damage. Abhorrent Oculus is going to put a ton of bodies on the board, so it allows you to kind of be aggressive with your Oculus when you're attacking, but then you also have these face-down creatures that could also just be other Djinns and other Oculus that you can turn up without paying its cost. So definitely really neat there. You're putting a lot of cards in your graveyard, so 1 Kiora does make sense. You get to deal damage to your opponent. If you have Threshold, then you end up getting an 8/8. You know, just a lot of power just gets added to the board. So A really cool deck overall, and I was actually really surprised to see it up here because I don't even think we had it as necessarily a deck to kind of watch out for at this event. I thought at least that it was like thoroughly just kind of like on the fringe of playability for the format, but it looks like we at least have one player who is very adept at playing this sort of strategy. Azorius aggro kind of leans into a lot of the Convoke things that we see from the Jeskai deck. This is maybe just a little bit more consistent for the cost of being a little less explosive, where you're not necessarily, I don't even think you really ever see like a turn 2 whatever it is, and actually you don't even see it in here. It's just definitely straight up more of an Azorius aggro deck than it is kind of like the Azorius Convoke style decks here. So that's a little bit my bad, but Enduring Curiosity, very powerful card. You just get to deal damage with a bunch of creatures, draw a bunch of cards, and in this deck you're going to be able to use some of that extra mana to play Mockingbirds to potentially copy just other bigger powerful creatures on your opponent's side of the board, as well as your own things too. So really cool there. And then 2 more Gruul aggro decks to kind of round out our top 8, with even Gruul aggro missing out on the top 8 in 9th place. And we kind of go down the line here. We have 10th Mono White Tokens, which is more like the Caretaker's Talent type strategy. We actually had an undefeated player on day 1, and I believe even started out the day 10-0 on this deck. So really cool there. This is a very annoying deck, and it definitely hoses a lot of the aggro decks, which we see a ton of these in the top 8. So definitely seemed like it was a very good choice for the weekend. We have another Dimir Enchantments deck, more Dimir mid-range here, which is kind of what we expected to be towards the top of the metagame, and unfortunately for them getting 12 to 13th, followed by 2 different Esper Pixie decks and Gruul aggro to round out our top 16. Oliver Tomiko also playing Gruul aggro, which is a 17th place finish. Ryan Condon going with Gruul aggro, Esper Pixie at 19th. Another Mono White Tokens, 2 Mono White Tokens player actually. Nathan Andrus, I believe, was the undefeated player going 10-0, and then unfortunately going 1-3-1 to end the day. Not ideal, but still a very good showing from him and this Mono White Tokens deck that again was really primed for the weekend. Domain control, we have Esper Pixie aggro, Gruul aggro, Dimir Enchantments, Mono Red aggro, Mono White Tokens, Gruul aggro, Esper Pixie, Gruul aggro, and Selesnya tokens to round it out, and even some more Gruul aggro decks. So really kind of what we've seen, there was a lot of aggro in this meta. I would have expected more of the mid-range decks, and as you'll see, we did actually get a lot of the mid-range decks too. So we'll kind of go over that in our metagame breakdown here, but definitely a very interesting event overall. I would say definitely beat some of my expectations, because I did expect a lot more of the mid-range decks and like Esper Pixie decks and like these value decks essentially to kind of be more towards the top. I think that they're usually pretty good, and I think that Dimir and some of these other mid-range type strategies were just kind of built to handle the aggro decks, and certainly that wasn't the case. I don't think these Gruul aggro decks really have too much different from each other. I think the basic game plan is going to be kind of the same. Unfortunately the blowout potential is there for playing things like the of course I can't remember the name of it. The good thing they bring up the deck list here. Monstrous Rage being the big one. We even see this version playing Leyline of Resonance to copy your spells that target your things. So, you end up getting a lot more mileage out of these turn inside outs and these Monstrous Rages when you can kind of go wide in this sort of strategy. But nonetheless, definitely surprising to me to see Gruul aggro and just aggro decks in general perform very well in this event, when I think kind of domain control is a little bit hostile to the aggro decks. I think that, again, the various mid-range decks are also very, can be very bad for Gruul aggro, but of course, proving me wrong. With that said, we'll go check out our day 1 metagame and then follow it up with our conversion rates for day 2. So here is our day 1 metagame breakdown for SCGCon Atlanta, the Foundations event. So Dimir midrange, we see here 210 decks, and then Gruul aggro had 205 decks, both about 14% of the metagame. So we were, in our predictions and stuff over on the podcast, we were talking about Dimir midrange essentially being kind of the deck to beat in the format. It's been doing very well in the challenges, not necessarily winning, but has been putting a lot of players in like the top 16s, top 32s, and just is a very solid deck overall. That it just has a lot of consistency to it. It has a lot of the best removal spells, and it's a deck that kind of breaks the mold of what you would see from typical mid-range decks like Golgari, where they're not necessarily playing this card advantage game. Their creatures just on rate are going to be a lot bigger, a lot better, and they're going to be able to dominate and control the board while just kind of slowly attritioning you out of the game. Where Dimir mid-range, its creatures are a little bit more frail, but they are pretty evasive. They can be very annoying to deal with, and of course Enduring Curiosity kind of tying it all together to just end up dealing a ton of damage to, well, dealing a little bit of damage to your opponent, but then drawing a bunch of cards. So while they're having to commit to the board and everything, you're be able to use your removal spells and be able to kind of dominate the game through just having the mana advantage, making sure that you're able to play a land every single turn and being able to multi-spell every turn while also getting to chip for damage. On top of that too, Kaido is one of the best planeswalkers in Standard currently, so this is, again, just also being a way to kind of shut down your opponent's creatures, give you another creature, ends up being a 3/4 on your turn, and getting you some card advantage as well if you're not able to have Enduring Curiosity. And again, kind of play this hit and run kind of strategy with a Dimir mid-range deck. Gruul aggro, we'd seen it with, Monstrous Rage and Questing Druid here, where you can just deal a ton of damage with this deck. This is kind of the way that you can race your Dimir opponent. You're kind of forcing them to use removal spells, not necessarily adding to their board either. Kind of the same thing with the Golgari mid-range decks, that you're able to just kind of eventually your opponent's going to run out of removal, and you have something like a Slick Shot Show Off in play, maybe even the Monastery Swift Spear. In the case of the Leyline deck, we have Cacophony Scamp as well, where you're able to get in just tons of damage on one swing, and you're kind of having your opponent on the back foot, and they're still having to deal with cards like Screaming Nemesis, where they can't really block it, and they're going to have a removal spell for it, but like only half of their removal actually works on the Screaming Nemesis. So definitely, like I said, ended up being a pretty good choice for the metagame, and we saw that a lot of players also kind of coming to that conclusion with just 5 less copies of it overall than what we thought was the best deck in the format. And I still think going forward is one of the best decks to be playing in the format. Again, followed by Golgari midrange. We kind of see this drop off about 5% of the metagame being Golgari midrange. Then we go into domain control and mono white tokens, 76 decks total for 5%. I think that this was definitely a very good pick. It was like kind of a sleeper pick, I would say, for the format, with how much aggro ended up actually being involved. And I don't know, don't quote me on it, I think mono white tokens also has a pretty decent mid-range matchup as well. I think it's just a deck that you can kind of, once you kind of get to that mid to late game, you can kind of grind your opponent out. You can end up kind of dealing with their things while also getting to draw multiple cards each turn. Carrot Cake being a laughably bad card, I would say, like really good in Bloomburrow Limited, but in this deck specifically, synergizes very well with all kind of the moving pieces that we have here that just, again, allow you to kind of take advantage of it and get a lot of miles out of that card, and also putting a lot of distance between you and your opponent. Esper Pixie, again, kind of the deck that we had for the last few weeks, and people thought it was a really good deck. It's a very annoying deck to play against, and 73 people brought it, and of course ended up doing very well. Mono red aggro, not really doing so hot, but some people still, I still kind of prefer mono red over Gruul aggro. I think that it's kind of hard to justify that pick now, considering that Gruul aggro just absolutely dominated putting 3 decks into the top 8 and then putting however many in the top 16 and the top 32. I think it's very hard to not play Gruul aggro at this point. But I think mono red aggro is still in a pretty good position for the format. Just Guy Convoke, unfortunately, no copies in the top 32. This is a deck that I personally had as kind of like a dark horse pick for being a very good deck in this format. Just with all the mid-range gunning around, I even think that you can not necessarily out aggro the aggro decks, but you can definitely, if they stumble, you can beat them, especially with your very powerful draws here. Azorius Oculus, 3% of the metagame. Temur Otters, 2%. And then we go down Sultai Beanstalk at 2%. Azorius Aggro. Selesnya Tokens, Boros Mice, and rounding out with Boros Aggro. And then 362 other decks making up the 25% of the metagame. So definitely, I would say a pretty diverse metagame overall. Yes, it does seem like it's very top-heavy, with having 2, almost 3 decks kind of break that 10% barrier there. So putting roughly 37% of the metagame over a third. in just those 3 decks. But really going down the line, you have like 3 different decks at 5%, you have another one at 6%, and then you have another one at 4%. I would say that this is a fairly diverse metagame overall. Definitely a lot of decks here that look really viable and actually looked really good against some of the new strategies and even some of the old strategies of the format. Really just, I think, solidifying the fact that Standard is in a very good place. And while I think a lot of players just kind of narrowed it down to like, okay, Dimir was the best deck going into this tournament, let's just play Dimir going into it. I want to play an aggro deck. Grill aggro has seemed to be like the most played aggro deck. Let's go play the most played aggro deck. And then from there, you just kind of have things that are shaking out, and a lot of decks that have a lot of good play against some of the more popular decks of the format. So very exciting there. That was our day 1 metagame. Let's go ahead and look at our day 2 metagame and how these decks actually did on day 1. So our day 2 metagame breakdown, of course, kind of what we expected. The most played decks in the format ended up putting the most decks in the format, or most decks in the format. They ended up putting the most decks into day 2. So Dimir midrange, we saw 210 decks, 62 of them ended up making day 2, where Gruul aggro had 1 less deck make it into day 2 with 5 less decks overall being played. So, at least by, versus those two, you could say that Gruul aggro had a little bit better of a day 1 than a lot of the Dimir midrange players, if only by a few players. Esper Pixie up there at 10%, 35 copies making day 2. We saw a lot of them pretty late in the day, being at like 6-0 and 7-0, or 7-1, 6-0, whatever the case may be. A lot of X1s going late into day 1. So not really surprised that Esper Pixie ended up doing very well just by those metrics and what I can remember from actually watching the event. Domain Control, Mono White Tokens, the next 2 decks at 28 copies and 16 copies respectively, good enough for 8 and 5% of the metagame. It's the other 2 decks that were about 5% of the metagame, Mono Red Aggro and Golgari Midrange. Azorius Oculus putting 11 into the next day, but somehow Selesnya Tokens is only considered 2% of the meta for having 1 more deck. So very interesting there. 9 Jeskai Convoke players making it to day 2, along with 7 Sultai Beanstalk players, 5 Azorius Aggro, 5 Mice, 4 Otters, 4 Aggro players, and then 52 other decks, making up 15% of that last part of that metagame. So, not surprised by Dimir midrange, Gruul aggro putting a ton of decks into day 2, just from the fact of, you had over 200 players register both archetypes, 60 plus of them from each ended up making day 2, so I would say pretty solid there. Esper Pixie, I think we only had like 70 to 80 Esper Pixie players. I think it might have been like 77 now that I think about it. So almost half of the players playing Esper Pixie ended up making day 2 of the tournament, which is very impressive here. And we can even kind of see that from like Domain Control was like the 3rd most played deck, and it ended up being the 4th most represented deck in day 2. So a little bit of a fall off there, where Esper Pixie definitely gained a lot of ground. Mono White Tokens only 16, and again, weird to think that, especially when one of those players was 9-0, and I think it ended up being a very good pick for this tournament. Mono Red Aggro kind of hanging out up there at 5%. Again, I think still a very solid option. Screaming Nemesis is a heck of a card. So is Monstrous Rage. You're able to kind of punk your opponents out of a lot of games. So definitely kind of nice to see a little bit of variety in the aggro decks, because again, we kind of have Jeskai Convoke, which is definitely an aggro deck, and then of course the various different Boros decks towards the bottom of the metagame. So definitely overall some things that we kind of expected. Again, Dimir midrange, Gruul aggro, you had that many players playing it. It would have been very surprising if, we had 200 Dimir or Gruul aggro players and they were hanging out with the other like Mono Red aggro players, with like at 16 or 20 copies or whatever. Just 10% of those players converting into day 2 would definitely be a telltale sign that something isn't right. So I think a lot of what we have to look at is kind of what overperformed and maybe what underperformed. And I think Esper Pixie is definitely one of those decks that overperformed. Again, there was about 70-ish players that ended up playing the deck, and almost half of them ended up converting into day 2, which is absolutely amazing, especially for a deck that's only been around for a few weeks. This is definitely something you're going to have to keep an eye out for. If you're playing the Arena ladder, you're going to be playing in Moto leagues, or maybe even playing in some of these standard challenges. On top of that, too, going to your RCQs, you're definitely going to have a game plan for this Esper Pixie deck. And we actually even did a deck tech on that video, or on that deck as well. You can check out that video when you're done watching this one, obviously. Domain also having a pretty good conversion rate. Mono White Tokens, I think I think also converting very well, if I remember the numbers right, roughly. And I think going forward that this is going to be a really sweet deck. I just think that if you end up playing this, you're going to have to work very, very, very hard to make sure that your games conclude naturally and you don't pick up any draws, because it's pretty easy to end up with draws playing this sort of deck, just because of how grindy it is and how long it takes, or how long it can actually take for the deck to close out a game. But, overall, for the Spotlight series, I think it was great. I think coverage was awesome. They did a very good job of kind of explaining what was going on. They definitely did a very good job of kind of showing off after round one, because round one, for some reason, we had like 16 minutes of Magic for, 40 to 50 minutes worth of breaks. I'm sure had tons of issues trying to stay online, considering they went live and had to shut it down and go back up multiple times on day one. But day two, they ended up getting it figured out. And still, even regardless of all those like technical problems, again, I think that the commentating was great. I think the gameplay was awesome. I think a lot of the information and stuff that we got going forward with a lot of these other Spotlight events, we're going to have a limited Spotlight event, I believe, in February or March, which is going to be really neat, because then that's like the, essentially kind of the continuation of these Grand Prix, where, if you remember, there were limited Grand Prix where you'd play a sealed deck, and they also had like team tournaments. And I'm looking forward to them actually doing a team Spotlight tournament series thing. Like, I think that would be really cool to do. We know that we are getting one for there's a Spotlight series for the Secret Lair sets. So if this is any indication, again, like getting a case of every booster box that's going to be legal in standard for 2025 is any indication of what the prizes will be for first place, I think it's going to be very hype, I'm going to say, when they revealed kind of the prize structure for, this Spotlight series Dragonstorm, which is going to be the new Tarkir set that comes out. And when we go even further for this Secret Lair Spotlight series, we're going to have in the United States as well, with, I believe, the limited Spotlight series taking place in Denver. And I don't exactly remember. I think the other one for the Secret Lair is going to be in Indianapolis, Indiana, coming up. And of course, we're going to be doing coverage in our own way for those events, just kind of getting a primer. We're going to be looking at the limited series, or the limited set, and kind of the things to know going into that Tarkir set once we actually get spoilers and we kind of get these other primers and stuff, and I'm able to read up and kind of look into the card files and things like that for what is actually going on. So if that's something that interests you, please consider subscribing again to the channel. I think we do a pretty good job. We usually have multiple videos covering kind of all this stuff, and I'm hoping to do my own kind of coverage a little bit better than we did for the Spotlight series in Atlanta, which was virtually non-existent up until this video that you're seeing right here. So definitely something that we're going to work on for 2025. We're going to be doing it for Spotlight events. We're going to be doing it for the Pro Tour. We're going to be doing it for Worlds, all that stuff, basically kind of continuing what we did last year. So again, subscribe, ring notification bell, all that stuff, if you want to get notified for those sort of things. But yeah, overall, I think the Spotlight series are definitely worth watching. I really want to play in one of these. I'm kind of hoping I can go to Indianapolis, but we'll end up seeing what happens. But, thank you all for watching the video. I hope you all enjoyed it, kind of this breakdown. Again, we're going to be doing a little bit more in-depth for the future Spotlight series and just getting you all ready for kind of like our own kind of watch guide for those events, and definitely going to be keeping an eye on it and all that fun stuff. This is great. Competitive Magic is so back in a massive way. 1,500 people to play standard, that would have been absurd just 2 years ago, once we kind of all came back from kind of the lockdown and all the restrictions and everything like that. It would have been absolutely insane. But now in 2025, Magic is absolutely booming, and I can't wait to see the modern events that we have. I can't wait to see more of the standard events. It's going to be a great time to be a competitive Magic player. But that's going to be from this video. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope to see you all in the next one.